After giving everything, she collapses in Billionaire's arms, and he finally says the words she needed. Landon Blake had never believed in miracles. His world was made of cold steel, glass towers, and numbers on screens. At just 30, he was already a billionaire, feared in boardrooms, admired in headlines. He was the kind of man who made decisions with logic, not feeling. His heart was locked behind years of betrayal, manipulation, and loss. To the world, he was brilliant, untouchable. To himself, he was just tired. Success didn't fill the hollow ache he carried. He dated models but slept alone. He laughed at parties but never truly smiled. That night had started like any other. Landon walked out of a ruthless board meeting, his mind spinning with numbers and contracts. The city lights sparkled beneath the cold black sky as he slipped into his favorite car, a sleek, midnight-colored sports coupe. The engine roared as he sped through the city's edge, chasing silence. But fate had other plans. A delivery truck, swerving to avoid a deer, slammed into Landon's car at full speed. Metal crunched, glass exploded, tires screeched into the night. The world flipped, once, twice, then silence. A terrible, haunting silence. The first responder found Landon unconscious, blood pooling around him. His chest barely moved, his pulse was fading. "We need to move now," the medic barked. "We're losing him." At the trauma center, chaos exploded. He was wheeled in with shattered ribs, a fractured spine, a collapsed lung. But worst of all, he was bleeding out. And his blood type? AB negative. Rare. Very rare. Time was running out. The lead trauma doctor made an emergency call. Every second ticked like a gunshot through the room. Meanwhile, across the city, in a tiny shared apartment above a bookstore, Clara Hayes was folding laundry. She was a quiet soul, a 22-year-old nursing student with big eyes and a heart even bigger. She worked part-time at a clinic and studied late into the night. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something told her to. "Are you Clara Hayes?" "Yes. Who is this?" "This is City Hospital. We have a critical emergency. You're an AB negative donor. We need you now." Clara didn't ask who. She didn't ask why. She just said, "I'll be there in 15 minutes. She threw on her sneakers, grabbed her bag, and ran. Inside the hospital, the lights were too bright, the air too cold. Nurses led her down sterile halls, past crying families and beeping machines. She was calm. Calm in a way only people who've felt pain know how to be. She lay back on the gurney. A nurse gently inserted the needle. Her blood, warm, rich, full of life, began to flow into the machine. She didn't know who was on the other side of that wall. She didn't know it was Landon Blake, the billionaire, the mogul, the man who'd never believed in angels. But that night, Clara Hayes became his. Not in love, not yet, but in a way deeper than most could ever understand. The doctors called it a miracle. They said her blood arrived just in time. They said he would have died without it. But Clara didn't stick around. She left quietly like she always did. To her, it was just something a good person does. She went home, made tea, and tried to study. She didn't know that her blood now flowed through a man whose heart had been frozen for years. She didn't know that she had already started to thaw it. And Landon? He would wake up 3 days later, his body broken. His mind clouded. But his heart, for the first time in years, beating to the rhythm of someone else's gift. The crash had taken his control, his pride, his certainty. But it had given him something else. A second chance, a lifeline. And far away in a dimly lit apartment, the girl who had saved him, without even knowing his name, folded her last towel, unaware that her life was about to change forever. The world came back to Landon Blake slowly, like light breaking through a thick fog. His eyes fluttered open, but everything was blurry. Pain radiated through his chest, his back, his legs, sharp, biting pain that reminded him he was still alive. Alive. Machines beeped softly beside him. The room was quiet, cold, and sterile. Sunlight filtered through the window, casting golden stripes on the floor. And there, in the corner, sat a girl. She was curled in a hard hospital chair, her knees tucked beneath her, head resting lightly on her arm. She looked exhausted but peaceful. She wore no makeup. Her sweater was worn at the sleeves. Her hair was loosely tied back. But there was something about her, a calmness, a gentleness, like a memory he couldn't place. Landon blinked again. His throat was dry, his lips cracked. He tried to speak, but it came out as a whisper. Hey. The girl stirred. Her eyes blinked open, warm hazel eyes that looked like autumn. When she realized he was awake, she stood quickly, smoothing down her jeans. I didn't think you'd be up yet, she said softly. I was just making sure you were okay. Her voice was delicate, yet strong. It wasn't fear he saw in her eyes. It was humility. She didn't want thanks. She didn't even seem to want recognition. Landon's vision cleared just enough to focus on her face. And something deep in him, something long locked away, stirred. Was it you? He asked, barely louder than a breath. She paused, then nodded almost apologetically. It was nothing, she said, just blood. Just blood. 2 words that meant the difference between life and death. But to Landon Blake, it wasn't just anything. In his world, nothing came without a cost. People didn't give freely. They took, they negotiated. They traded favors like currency. But this girl, she'd given him life, without knowing his name, without asking for anything. He tried to sit up, winced, then gave up. She stepped forward instinctively. Don't move, the doctor said your ribs are still healing. There was something comforting about her presence. A quiet kindness that wrapped around him like a blanket. He didn't even know her name. And yet, he felt like she'd already touched the deepest part of him, literally and emotionally. What's your name? He asked. She hesitated, then answered, Clara Hayes. He whispered it once to himself, like he wanted to remember how it felt. She glanced at the door, shifting uncomfortably. I should go. You'll need rest. He wanted to ask her to stay. He wanted to tell her she was the only thing in the room that didn't feel cold or mechanical. But she was already halfway out the door. Clara, he called weakly. She turned. Thank you. She offered a small smile. Take care of yourself, Mr. Blake. And then she was gone. The room suddenly felt colder, the light harsher. He closed his eyes, but instead of darkness, he saw her, sitting quietly, her sweater sleeves pulled over her hands. After that moment, nothing felt the same. The nurses came in, the doctors examined him. Everyone praised the donor who'd saved him, but no one knew her. Landon couldn't stop thinking about her. She didn't act impressed by who he was. She didn't gush over his name or ask for pictures. She looked at him like he was just a person, a hurting person. He asked his assistant to find her, not to stalk her, not to interfere, just to learn, to understand the mystery of this girl who'd shown him more humanity in 5 minutes than anyone had in years. Who was she? Why had she done it? And why did his heart ache now that she was gone? He didn't know it yet, but something inside him had already begun to change. A man who once believed only money could save him had been saved by something else entirely. And the girl who left without fanfare had unknowingly left something behind. A quiet warmth, a question without an answer, and the beginning of a love story neither of them had planned for. Clara didn't want to go. She had ignored Landon Blake's invitation the first time. And the second? What could she possibly have in common with a man who lived in a world of helicopters and headlines? She'd done what she had to do at the hospital, nothing more. But the third time, something tugged at her. Not guilt, not curiosity. It was that look in his eyes. Not the billionaire's gaze. The man's gaze, quiet, tired, and grateful. So she said yes. One word, one decision, and it changed everything. When the black car pulled up to her apartment, she felt strange sitting in the back seat. She clutched her small purse tightly in her lap, her fingers trembling slightly. What was she doing? The driver opened the gates to Landon's estate, and it took her breath away. The mansion was a modern masterpiece of glass, stone, and open skies. It looked like it belonged in a movie. Yet as she stepped inside, she felt something else. Loneliness. Landon met her at the door. No suit, no arrogance. Just a soft gray sweater, a healing body, and eyes that searched hers with something almost like hope. Thank you for coming, he said. They walked slowly through the halls. He offered tea, but she chose coffee. He smiled. You're real, I like that. She smiled back just a little. still guarded, still unsure. They sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking hills that rolled like waves in the golden afternoon light. And they talked. Not about business, not about donations or fame or statistics. They talked about life, about pain. Clara told him things she hadn't said out loud in years. About being tossed between foster homes, never knowing what safe meant. About being called quiet in every school because she was too tired to talk. About nights spent studying while other girls went to prom. About how she worked double shifts at a diner and studied between tables. How she wanted to be a nurse because she knew what it was like to feel invisible. Landon didn't speak for a long time. Then slowly he began to share his own truths. About growing up in a mansion where nannies raised him and board meetings replaced birthday parties. About his father's cold words, "Love is weakness." About fake friends who disappeared the moment his stocks dipped. About betrayal that came wrapped in a silk dress and a champagne glass. He looked down at his hands and whispered, "I built this empire to protect myself, but it never really worked." Clara just listened. She didn't offer pity. She offered presence, and that was more than he'd had in years. For hours they talked, and when she stood to leave, something heavy hung in the air, unspoken, but understood. But then came the call. Landon's doctor. He stepped into another room to take it. Clara sipped her coffee, staring out at the hills, unaware that the next words he'd hear would change everything. His spine wasn't healing as expected. There was inflammation, lingering nerve damage. The risk of permanent impairment was rising. There was one last option, an experimental stem cell procedure, with promising success, but it required an ultra-rare match and a very specific condition. The donor had to be a virgin. Stem cells of that type held an undisturbed purity, a fragile scientific quality that made them ideal for nerve repair. There was only one known match in the hospital's recent donor bank, Clara Hayes. Landon froze. He felt the walls close in, not because of the science, but because asking this again felt like invading something sacred. She had already saved him once. Could he ask for more? He walked back to the living room. Clara turned, sensing something in his face had shifted. "What is it?" she asked gently. He sat down, breathing carefully. "I need to tell you something, and you have every right to walk out after." Her brows furrowed. She said nothing. He explained everything, the treatment, the risk, the match, her. When he finished, the room fell into a stillness that felt like snow. Clara looked away, her face unreadable. "I see," she said softly. "I didn't want to ask," he added quickly. "I know it's deeply personal. I would never pressure you." She nodded slowly. "I'm not ashamed of who I am," she said. "I just never thought that part of me could be used to save someone again." Then she looked at him, deeply, quietly. "I'll think about it," she said. "Not because you're rich, not because you're broken, but because you're honest, and I see the pain in you." Then, with quiet grace, she gathered her things. And as she walked toward the door, Landon whispered, "You're the strongest person I've ever met." Clara paused. "Strength doesn't mean you're not scared," she said. "It means you still choose to care." Then she was gone, and Landon was left in a house full of walls. Only now they felt a little less permanent, and a little less cold. Landon Blake stood at the window of his study, staring into the black velvet sky. It was past midnight. The house was silent, too silent. He hadn't slept in days. Not from pain, but from the question, should he ask her? Could he ask her? He had everything a man could dream of. A legacy, a name, empires. But all of that was now slipping through his hands like water. His body, still fragile, was beginning to betray him again. The experimental treatment, the last hope, hung like a heavy curtain in his thoughts. One chance, one path, one match, Clara. And the requirement? Virginity, a word that felt too intimate to say aloud, too sacred to attach to science, too personal to be dragged into his desperation. But he had no choice. His doctor's voice echoed in his mind. "If you wait, nerve damage could become permanent. If she consents, we can schedule immediately, but she has to know everything." He didn't want to ask. Not her. Not Clara. The girl who had already given him blood, time, and something far more valuable, truth. But time was running out, so he called her. A soft, unsure call. "Could you come over? There's something I need to talk to you about, alone." She agreed, not because she owed him, but because she could hear the weight in his voice, a kind of tremble he never used. She arrived wearing a long gray coat and simple shoes. No makeup, no armor. Landon waited in his study, the fire flickering low behind him. The air smelled faintly of cedar wood and books. He stood when she entered. She gave a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "What is it, Landon?" He gestured for her to sit. He took the chair across from her, close, but not too close. His hands trembled slightly, so he folded them in his lap. "There's something I have to tell you," he said softly. "And I hate that it has to be me asking you again." Clara's brows furrowed gently. Her silence was patient. She waited for him to continue. He took a slow breath. "The doctors ran more scans. My spine isn't healing the way they hoped. The pain's getting worse. They say if I don't act now—" He paused. "I could lose the ability to walk, maybe forever." Clara's eyes didn't blink. She didn't gasp or overreact. Just listened. "There's a treatment," he continued. "Stem cell-based, highly specific. It works best with untouched donors, people who've never, you know." His voice faltered. He felt heat rush to his face. Clara's expression didn't change. No shock, no judgment, just calm. "You mean virgins?" she said softly. He nodded, ashamed of the word on his tongue. "Yeah, and I'm the match," she said. He looked up at her, eyes burning. "You are, again. I swear I never wanted to ask you for anything else, especially not this." The fire cracked behind them. She looked down, her hands resting in her lap. The silence was thick, not awkward, but heavy. Like it carried everything they weren't saying. "Would it hurt?" she finally asked. He shook his head. "No more than a blood draw. It's a medical procedure. You'll be under light sedation. No invasion of privacy, but—" He hesitated. "It is personal. Intimate in a way, not in action, but in meaning." She nodded, staring at the flames. He watched her profile, the way her brow furrowed slightly, the way her lips pressed together in quiet thought. She could have said no. He would have understood. He expected her to say no. But then her voice broke through the quiet. "If it gives you a second chance, it's worth it." He blinked, not believing it, not comprehending how someone like her existed in a world like his. "Clara," he whispered, "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you." She looked at him then, really looked at him. Her eyes weren't just kind. They were clear, seeing through him, past the money, past the legacy, past the fear. "You're starting to be someone who does," she replied. And that was it. No contracts, no hesitation. She agreed, not for glory, not for gain, but because she saw something in him worth saving. Not just the man, but the soul inside him that was finally waking up. In that quiet room, with soft firelight dancing on the walls, something unspoken passed between them. Not passion, not desire, but trust. And Landon knew then, this woman wasn't just his match in blood or biology. She was his mirror, the person who reflected back everything he had lost, and everything he still had the chance to become. The procedure was scheduled for a Thursday morning. The sky was clear, the air crisp. Landon stared up at the ceiling of the operating room, trying not to let fear take over. Not fear of the procedure, but fear of what this all meant. He wasn't used to needing anyone, but now everything he was rested in Clara's hands. She smiled at him through the glass just before they sedated him. And somehow, that smile made the storm in his chest go still. The transplant took less than 3 hours. Science did its work. But the real healing had already begun. Quietly, silently, long before the anesthesia touched his veins. When Landon woke, Clara was sitting beside him. She held a book in her lap, legs curled under her, sipping tea. She looked up when he stirred. "Hey," she said, like nothing extraordinary had happened. But it had. She had given him a second chance at life, again. And something inside him, deeper than bone, deeper than blood, began to repair. Recovery came in stages, first a tremble in his toes, then the faint flex of his calf. Then one morning, 2 weeks later, he stood up. It felt like flying, like living. He wasn't just walking again. He was feeling again. And every time he looked at Clara, he swore his chest wasn't big enough to hold the gratitude. But it wasn't just the physical healing. The man who once ruled from ivory towers now walked among the forgotten. He visited the hospital that had saved him. He didn't wear a suit, just jeans, a plain hoodie, and a baseball cap. He sat with children in the waiting rooms, read to them. He funded free clinics in neighborhoods he'd never stepped foot in before. But he didn't just throw money at problems. He listened. He asked questions. He learned. Clara was beside him through it all. She didn't pose for pictures. She didn't speak at galas. But she spoke to him when no one else was watching. They shared quiet evenings on rooftops, drinking cocoa instead of champagne. They read books aloud to each other, science, poetry, even old fairy tales. She laughed when he admitted he'd never read a novel that didn't come with a business lesson. "Then you've never really read," she teased. And he knew she was right. She showed him things he never knew he'd been missing. Like how rain smelled when you didn't run from it. How soup tasted when you made it from scratch. How silence wasn't empty, it was sacred. And he showed her that not all rich men were hollow inside. He didn't just build new hospitals, he named them after people who inspired him. Nurses, teachers, grandmothers, forgotten heroes. And then, there was her. One night, weeks into his recovery, they stood on the rooftop of his home. The city lights shimmered beneath them like fireflies trapped in glass. Clara leaned on the railing, her hair tucked behind one ear, the wind brushing gently through it. He stood beside her, no cane, no brace, just him. He took her hand. Her fingers were soft, steady. "You didn't just save my life," he said, voice low, barely more than a breath. "You taught me how to live." She turned to him, her eyes wide, glistening, not from tears but from truth. He stepped closer. There was no dramatic music, no storm, no fireworks. Just warmth. The warmth of two souls who had collided not through fate, but through choice, through sacrifice, through quiet bravery. He leaned in, and gently, reverently, their lips met. It wasn't fire. It wasn't hunger. It was peace. The kind of kiss that heals places no scalpel ever could. They stayed like that for a moment, wrapped in each other, under the stars. The wind whispered through the trees. Somewhere below, a child laughed in the distance. And for the first time in a long, long time, Landon Blake, the billionaire who once believed in nothing but control, felt whole. Because healing isn't always found in hospitals. Sometimes it's found in hearts. And the woman beside him, she hadn't just given him blood, or cells, or a second chance. She had given him himself back. 6 months later, the sun rose over the city with a warmth that felt almost symbolic. No crowds lined the streets. No helicopters buzzed overhead. No tabloids snapped secret photos or chased headlines, because this wasn't that kind of wedding. Landon Blake, one of the richest men in the country, could have rented a palace in Europe. He could have bought an island or filled a cathedral with royalty. But instead, he chose a hospital. Not just any hospital. The hospital where his heart first woke up. Where Clara gave him blood. Where she gave him hope. The small courtyard behind the trauma wing had been transformed. Soft white lights hung between trees. Modest chairs formed a circle around a handmade arch draped in simple flowers. And the guests? They weren't celebrities. They were nurses. Doctors. Patients Clara once held during seizures. A child Landon had helped get life-saving surgery. A janitor who once sat and talked to Clara during her night shifts. It was a gathering of souls, not status. People who had lived and lost and healed together. Clara walked down the aisle with no veil. Just a soft ivory dress that caught the light and made her look like a painting. She held no bouquet. Her hands were free to reach for the man who waited at the end of the aisle. And Landon, he wasn't just a man in love. He was a man reborn. He wore a simple suit, no tie, no ego. He looked at Clara like she was everything the world had forgotten to value. And maybe, finally, he had remembered. They didn't recite traditional vows. They spoke from the heart. "I once believed control was power," Landon said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought money could fix everything. But it was your kindness that saved me. Not once, but twice. You gave without asking, loved without pushing, and stood by me when I didn't know how to stand on my own." Clara's voice trembled as she spoke. I didn't come into your life to fix you. I came because something in me knew you still had healing left to do, and I stayed, because you chose to become the kind of man the world needs." They kissed, soft and reverent, and the courtyard erupted in gentle applause and more than a few tears. Later that evening, beneath the golden glow of string lights, Landon took a microphone in his hand. He wasn't speaking to reporters. He wasn't addressing shareholders. He was speaking to human beings. 6 months ago, he began, I was dying. Not just physically. My soul was dried up, buried under years of ambition, control, and fear. He paused, looking at Clara. She smiled gently as if reminding him she was still here. A girl with no money, no fame, no reason to care, gave me her blood. Then she gave me something even greater, herself. He took a shaky breath. And I learned something. Kindness is the currency that actually matters. Love, real love, is not found in power. It's found in sacrifice, in the quiet choice to help someone who can never repay you. The crowd fell into stillness. Even the trees seemed to lean closer. Today we launched the Clara Foundation, he continued. Free health care for the forgotten, support for single parents, access to medication for communities who've never had it. Cheers erupted. Clara covered her mouth in quiet shock, tears forming in her eyes. She didn't know he had named it after her. She didn't want that kind of spotlight. But this wasn't about fame. It was about legacy. Her story spread across the country, not because she sought it, but because people needed it. In a world torn by division, greed, and noise, her quiet voice reminded people that the most powerful hearts often beat in the most unseen places. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't a politician. She was a nurse, a girl who answered the phone, a soul who chose to care, again and again. And through her, a billionaire was reborn as a human, not because he had to be, but because she showed him he could. They spent their honeymoon not in the Maldives, but in a clinic they built in a low-income neighborhood, hand in hand. He carried boxes. She treated patients. They laughed over sandwiches between shifts. They sat on benches under the stars, just like they had on his rooftop. And that night, as she rested her head on his chest, he whispered, "Thank you for seeing me when I didn't even see myself." She smiled into his shirt. "Thank you for becoming the man I always knew you could be." And beneath that sky, no rain, no storm, just the warm hush of night, two souls healed not just each other, but a piece of the world, too.